Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the release of the ASER 2021 report. This is the 16th annual Status of Education report, the findings of which will be shared with you live today. This release is a bit different from our past releases, as you will see, but hopefully post the release, you will have the opportunity to engage with us on social media, on email, and through the findings of the report to share your comments, reflections, and feedback. So welcome once again to everybody who's joining us from India and from other parts of the world. Please do remember that this link will remain live post the release as well, and you can share the release event as widely as you would like once the release is over as well. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Director of ASER Center, Dr. Willima Wadhwa, to kick us off for today's release. Welcome, Willima.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to all of you, our partners, volunteers, Pratham and state teams, and good friends from here and abroad. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today for the release of ASER 2021. As you know, schools shut down in India in March of 2020 and are just starting to reopen 18 months later. India had one of the longest durations of school closures during the pandemic, due to the pandemic in the world. During this period, because movement in the field was severely restricted, we adapted ASER to a phone format, and ASER 2020 was done on the phone, focusing on access to learning materials and enrollment during the time that schools were closed in September of last year. With the horrific second wave, we didn't think that it would be safe to do ASER in the field this year. And we therefore decided to do ASER as a phone survey again this year. And ASER 2020 was done in September and October of this year, a year later after ASER 2020, and it revisits some of the themes of last year. So ASER 2021 is also focused on enrollment, access to learning materials, and support of children in learning at home. It was conducted across 581 districts in 28 states and union territories with over 75,000 households. Last year, the enrollment scenario was fairly fluid, and it was difficult to say whether some of the changes that we were seeing were going to hold. At the time that ASER 2021 was being administered, about 2/3 of the schools had reopened, and most of the children in these reopened schools were attending school physically. So while the situation is still far from normal, we are seeing some big changes, and ASER 2021 gives a picture of this transition period in terms of school reopening. We have kept the release very simple today, keeping in mind that all of us are Zoom fatigued and paneled out. So I will start us off with some main findings of the report, followed by comments by Madhav and Rukmini. The report will be available on our website, and I hope that you will have a look at the full detailed report. But before I begin, I'd like to thank everyone who was involved in and supported ASER this year. We had over 3,500 volunteers from universities, colleges, NGOs from across the country. The Pratham teams as always supported us throughout the process, and they participated in the school survey as well. And of course, it's the ASER teams who held the entire effort together. So a big thank you and congratulations to everyone who made ASER possible this year. And now let's look at some of the main findings of the report. So the main findings of ASER 2021 are in 4 main areas. These are enrollment, tuition classes, availability of smartphones at home and children's access to them, learning materials and support for learning at home. Like ASER 2020, ASER 2021 was also a household survey conducted on the phone. Like previous ASER surveys, ASER 2021 is also a rural survey representative at the state and national levels. This year, ASER was done in 25 states and 3 union territories across 581 districts with more than 75,000 households in over 17,000 villages. We also spoke to teachers and headmasters in about 7,500 government schools. Of these, about 5,000 were schools that had reopened, and about 2,500 were those which were yet to reopen. The big headline of ASER, the first big headline of ASER 2021 is from enrollment. And the big change that we are seeing this year is an increase in the proportion of children enrolled in government schools. Now, government school enrollment has been steady around 65% in the last few years. And we did not see any increase in government school enrollment even last year. But this year, we see a big jump of almost 5 percentage points, taking government school enrollment to about 70%. In contrast, private schooling has been rising steadily in India since 2006, from about 16% till it reached about 30% in 2014, and has remained around there since then. For the first time, though, in 2020, we saw a drop in the proportion of 6 to 14-year-olds enrolled in private schools. But last year, we didn't see any shift to government schools. Instead, what we saw was that the proportion of not currently enrolled children went up from 2.5% in 2018 to 4.6% in 2020. When we dug a little bit deeper, we saw that most of this increase was for younger age groups, and I'll talk a little bit about that a few slides down. This year, in contrast, the not currently enrolled proportion has remained steady at 4.6, and private school enrollment has continued to drop and now is below 25%. And instead, we have seen a shift to government schools this year. Now, there could be a variety of reasons behind that. First, families have suffered a fair amount of financial distress during the pandemic, which may have led them to shifting their children from private schools where they have to pay fees to government schools. Also, during the pandemic, many affordable private schools have shut down across the country, and so children may have shifted to government schools. And also, during this period, many migrants have moved back to their villages, and that may have also led to an increase in the demand for public schooling. Now, in fact, our school data actually confirms this. When we asked teachers and headmasters in government schools that had reopened if there had been an increase in enrollment in their schools, 70% said that yes, indeed, enrollment in their schools had gone up. We probed a little bit deeper and asked them what they thought was behind it. And 62% said that it was because of financial distress. Another 50% said that it was because there were free facilities available in government schools. Another 40% said that there was not much activity going on in private schools, and that may be a reason why parents had shifted their children to government schools. And finally, 15% said that it could be because of migration. Now, this increase in government schooling that we are seeing is not restricted to any age or grade or gender. In fact, we see this increase for all ages and all grades across the board. So, for instance, if we look at young boys in the age group of 7 to 10, the proportion in government school went up from about 60% to almost 68%. Similarly, for young girls in the age group of 7 to 10, the proportion enrolled in government school went up from about 68% to 72%. And you see this increase in government school enrollment across grades as well. Even before COVID, the proportion of girls enrolled in government schools was higher than that of boys. And this is continued, though the gap has narrowed between the two. As always, there are wide variations across states in government school enrollment, and the increase in government school enrollment that we are seeing at the All India level is being driven by the large northern states and the southern states. The largest increase that we see in government school enrollment has come from UP of over 13 percentage points, followed by Kerala of about 12 percentage points. All the southern states, other than Telangana, showed an increase of more than 8 percentage points in government school enrollment. And even states like Bihar and West Bengal, which have traditionally had very high government school enrollment, over 70%, showed further increases in government school enrollment. Now let's look at children who are currently not enrolled. So last year, we saw an increase in the proportion of currently not enrolled children. And though this increase was concentrated for the younger age groups. So if we look at young 7 to 10-year-old boys, the proportion who were currently not enrolled went up from 1.4% in 2018 to 4.7%. But since then, it has held steady, and we don't see any further increases this year. The situation is the same for young girls, where the proportion not currently enrolled went up from 1.4% to 4.1% in 2020 and has remained the same since then. Interestingly, slightly more boys are not enrolled in school as compared to girls in both age groups. Also, through this entire period, the percentage of not enrolled 15 to 16-year-olds has been the age group that is considered most at risk of dropping out has been steadily declining from about 16% in 2010. It was 12% in 2018 and has continued to decline during the pandemic to about 10% last year and is now at about 6.5%. So while the pandemic has resulted in some increase in the proportion of children who are not currently enrolled, this is mostly for younger age groups. It is possible that many of these may get re-enrolled once schools are fully reopened. And also remember that younger children are easier to re-enroll, and states can organize enrollment drives as they have in the past. The next big headline of ASER 2021 has to do with tuition classes. Here we see big increases in the proportion of children taking tuition during this period. At the All India level, the incidence of tuition has remained steady between 25 to 30% for the last many years. And this is the case across grades as well as both types of schools. In 2020, we saw a jump in tuition at the All India level from 28.6% to 32.5%. And this has continued this year. And we are now at a situation that almost 40% children are attending tuition classes. And this only points to the fact that parents are trying to provide supplemental learning support during the pandemic. While there is a fair amount of variation in the incidence of tuition across states, by and large, we've seen an increase in tuition across the board in all states. Even in states like Bihar and West Bengal, which are traditionally high tuition states with tuition over 60%, we have seen an increase this year. The only exception is Kerala, where tuition dropped from 28% to 18% in 2021. And we discussed this with our Kerala teams in terms of why they thought this might be happening. What they were speculating was that, after the second wave, even after the All India numbers had settled down, the Kerala numbers remained high for a fairly long time, and they continue to remain high. So that may have affected this, with children not being able to go for tuition classes. But we are speculating here. With the shift to remote learning, children's access to digital devices has become very important. And often this device is the smartphone at home. So let's look at the findings relating to smartphones and children's access to them. Between 2018 and 2021, smartphone penetration has almost doubled in rural India. Smartphone penetration increased from 36.5% in 2018 to about 62% in 2020, and has continued to rise this year, so that about 68% of children have at least one smartphone at home. We also asked whether families had purchased a smartphone during this pandemic for their children's studies. In 2020, this was the case for about 9% of the children. And in 2021, this proportion has trebled to 27.9. However, having the smartphone at home does not automatically translate to children having access to the device. Across all grades, about 68% children have at least one smartphone at home, but as many as 26% of these have no access to the smartphone. There is substantial variation in access to smartphone by grade of children, and understandably, older children in higher grades have greater access. So younger children in grades 1 and 2, as many as 40% of them had no access to a smartphone, even if there was a smartphone in the home. While smartphone penetration has been rising across most states, there is a fair amount of variation in the access to the smartphone. In this graph, in the upper panel, we show the smartphone penetration state-wise, and in the lower panel, we show the access to the smartphone. In the lower panel, we show that even if there is a smartphone in the home, the proportion of children who have no access to it. So at the All India level, about 67.6% children had at least one smartphone in the home, and but 26% of them had no access to it. The data shows that the higher the percentage of families who have at least one smartphone in the home, the higher the probability that the child will have access to it. So for instance, on the upper end of the spectrum, you have states like Himachal and Kerala who have almost universal penetration of smartphones. And as you can see, in these states, very few children have no access to the smartphone. On the other hand, you have states at the lower end, you have states like West Bengal and Bihar, where smartphone penetration is below 60%. And here you can see that half of the children have no access to the phone, even if there is a phone in the home. Next, let's look at learning support at home and access to learning materials. One of the big findings of ASER 2020 was that many family members stepped up, and as many as 75% children had someone in the home who was helping them with their studies during the period when schools were closed. This year, this number has come down to about 67%. Now, with children going back to school, maybe parents feel that less help is needed at home. And indeed, our data shows that with children in not reopened schools getting slightly more help from home as compared to children in schools which have reopened. And we see this for both government and private schools. Also, with the economy opening up and parents going back to work, they may have less time to help children in their studies. And again, we see this in the data with children getting less help in learning at home from their fathers in 2021 as compared to 2020. Next, let's look at the provision of textbooks. This was the big success story of last year, with 80% children having the textbook of their current grade. Government schools were more successful than private schools in distributing textbooks, with 84% children in government schools last year having the textbook of their current grade as compared to 72% children in private schools. This trend has continued this year, and now we have 92% children who had the textbook of their current grade. While government schools still outperform private schools have made a big effort and now are close to the number in government schools. And so the gap between the two has narrowed. Even states that were lagging behind last year in the distribution of textbooks have caught up, and in most states, textbook distribution was over 90%. Apart from textbooks, schools shared a variety of learning materials remotely. Across all types of schools and grades, the availability of learning materials was higher in 2021 as compared to 2020. So if we look at schools that had not reopened, 37.6% children in government schools this year that had not reopened said that they had received learning materials from their schools, and this was higher than 33.5% last year. The availability was even higher in schools that had reopened, but this was most likely due to the fact that the homework constitutes a major source of learning material. So to end, ASER 2021 was a phone survey like ASER 2020 and was carried out in September and October of this year. At this time, many states' schools had opened, and at least for some classes. So ASER 2021 provides a snapshot of India at a time of transition in terms of school reopening. In enrollment, there was a significant increase in the proportion of children enrolled in government schools in many states. Of course, time will tell if this is a temporary phenomenon driven by financial distress and migration or a more permanent feature. But in the meanwhile, states that have experienced a large increase in government school enrollment need to be prepared for the implication of this increase at the classroom level. During the extended period of school closures, we also saw an emergence of tuition or local coaching classes as a response, and this is not surprising. Nationally, in 2018, less than 30% children took tuition classes, but by 2021, this number had reached 40%. While smartphone penetration has almost doubled between 2018 and 2021, ASER 2021 shows that even if there is a smartphone in the family, children often do not have access to it. And this finding needs to be taken into account as future plans are made for remote learning and the use of digital content. And finally, in 2021, though access to textbooks is almost universal, remote provision of teaching learning materials in schools that are still closed remains a little bit inadequate. The full detailed ASER report will be available on our website. Please do have a look, and thank you so much for staying with us through this presentation. And I will now hand over to Devyani for the next part of the release.
Thank you so much, Willima. I think definitely an important set of findings from the report this year. And I think a lot of food for thought for our audience, for education practitioners, for government, for policymakers to keep in mind as we are emerging from the pandemic and children are starting to go back to school. As Willima mentioned, we would now like to move forward with some comments from Dr. Madhav Chavan and Dr. Rukmini Banerjee. Many of you will know Dr. Madhav Chavan, who is the co-founder of Pratham Education Foundation and has been a part of the ASER effort right from day one. I'd now like to invite Dr. Chavan to share his comments and reflections on the findings. So over to you, Madhav. Sorry, you're on mute, Madhav.
Thank you, Devyani. Congratulations, big congratulations to the ASER team for the 16th annual status of education report. Um, a lot has been done in spite of the pandemic, although, of course, it was on the phone. Still hard work and well done. As always, working day and night till the last minute to publish the report and release it. As you heard Willima talk about the main findings, the main thrust of the report, and so on and so forth. As I was listening to Willima, occurred to me that gradually we are coming out of the pandemic. Well, that's obvious. But when the pandemic hit us, in a matter of weeks, people were already talking about the new normal and were wondering whether education, schools, etc., would be the same in the new normal. And it's not clear that the new normal is here. Because if you look at what the schools are doing or what the schools are going to do, it seems like we are going back to what we were doing. Is there a new normal? That's the one question I want to raise, and which is something that is worth studying. It's not a subject of an annual report. It's something I think we'll have to monitor on a regular basis to see. Yes? We will have to monitor the schools to see how they are operating, because there are reports coming from communities, villages, and so on that say that the children are not all going to school. There are some staying back, some attending, some not attending. So for the schools to settle down, I think it's going to take some time. The question is, what are the schools doing to get back to some kind of a normal, new normal, old normal, whatever situation? This is where not just the monitoring. I think as you know, ASER and Pratham are together. ASER is the analytical side of Pratham, but Pratham also works in communities and in schools. We need to go back into the schools and say, how can all children be attending schools regularly? How can that be done? We've been talking about promoting the catch-up program. Already you've seen ASER publish results about Karnataka and how learning loss has happened in a big way, almost a year lost, and more reports are going to come soon. So while we are looking at learning loss in reading and arithmetic, there could be learning loss of other kinds that we need to look at. So as we start doing that, there's a need to gear up the catch-up program and make sure that we monitor what's happening, not on annual basis, but more frequent basis. How can we do that? That is the question. The ASER team can certainly think about it. And there are alliance partners. There are partners all around the country who could be doing small or big studies to see how schools are doing. I want to emphasize again that this is not a matter of an annual study. It is something that has to be done on a regular basis and understood. And regular feedback needs to be given to the government and to the public at large as to what is and what is not happening. Disturbance of this kind, this pandemic disruption, it can be very deep. The habit of going to school, excuse me, the habit of sitting in a classroom, the habit of talking to the children on the teacher's part, or listening and studying and understanding, all have been broken. This is not just a matter of children going back into school, walking to school. That also is difficult. But the classroom itself, how is classroom disrupted? Can we undertake studies of this kind? In what ways has the classroom been disrupted? They were closed. Now we are coming back to some kind of a normalcy, but where is the disruption? And is that disruption something that can be repaired by merely opening schools and saying children come to schools? Does it happen? Maybe it can. It's as simple as that. Maybe it is not. So I think we need to do that. There are the kinds of studies that ASER has not done before, but we need to look at some psychological parameters of what is happening to children. Psychological studies have to be undertaken. I don't know if anybody is doing that, but we could certainly bring together an alliance of people, universities and NGOs to look at things that ASER doesn't. And these reports, this information has to come into the public domain, because it is entirely possible that the damage is far deeper than we can see. And what we see in the learning loss is quite deep, but there could be other things that we need to look at. How does a child recover to come back to the learning process? Or has the learning process altered? For example, today we heard that the number of smartphones has increased in households, almost doubled over the pandemic period. Although access to children for studying is not regular, not always there. Not everybody has access. We know that. But children have been using smartphones or other devices much more than before. I mean, this is anecdotal that I'm talking about, but we need to check that. And when children deal with technology of this kind, they learn other things. Maybe not learn reading and writing and arithmetic, but they may be learning things that we had not imagined. I know, because I've been dealing with the digital application in learning processes. And I know that when children are given devices in their hands, they start experimenting. They start learning much more than adults can. Now, what else have the children learned? Recently, I got a report from the field. We are trying to do courses in digital readiness. And this is with older age group, admittedly. But the report we got back was that these young people started saying, why are you doing this digital readiness with us? We know how to handle Facebook. We know how to handle all the other apps and so on. We don't really need this. When did they learn this? They must have learned when they had the device in their hand. And whether it's your friend's device or your own device, you may have learned other things. So there is a need to find out, if children have not learned some things that was meant to be taught in schools, then over the 2 years, what else have they learned? Can we do that? It's a question mark. But I can't believe that children have not learned anything. Children don't just sit at home and do nothing. Their mind, whether it's angel's workshop or devil's workshop, is absorbing things and is doing things. And we need to take a look at it. Anyway, so you already heard the status of education. My point is that we need to go deeper, wider. We need to study more frequently, and not only once in a year. So congratulations to the ASER team one more time. And I think it's time for me to stop and hand over to Devyani. Devyani, thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Madhav. Thank you for those words. And I think a lot of new ideas, as always. Great to hear from you, and opportunities for us to kind of further delve into what has transpired during the pandemic, and what can be done to further understand the situation. As Willima mentioned at the close of her presentation, the report will be available on asercenter.org. So you can access the website shortly after the release to access the full report and related documents on asercenter.org. And for more information, you can write to us at contact@asercenter.org or info@pratham.org. I'm now going to invite Dr. Rukmini Banerjee, CEO of Pratham Education Foundation and Director of ASER Center, to talk to us about her comments and her reflections from this year's report and the findings that we have all heard from Wilma. So welcome, Rukmini, over to you.
Thank you, Devyani. If this was an actual ASER release, then by this time, the tables on the lawns outside would be getting ready for lunch. And I'm completely convinced that the ASER release in Delhi, at least, is very popular, only partly because of the results, but partly because of the sunshine outside and how you can meet and mingle with friends who are interested in education. But we have learned how to do this on Zoom. And so hopefully this is our last ASER release done virtually, and from next year again, we can all be together. But in the meanwhile, I think that Wilma has provided a very clear glimpse of what ASER was able to see this year in September. It's a very interesting time because I think that we are in transition. In many places, schools have opened, but not all classes have opened. In some other places, we are still waiting for schools to open. And I think there is a third condition, like where we are today in Delhi, where schools opened and had to shut again. So I think that these are the kinds of conditions perhaps that we will have to operate in some months ahead of us. And the more we learn how to be flexible and use each opportunity to the best of our ability, the better it will be for our children's learning. This year's ASER, I think, shows some of these forward movements in transition. I just want to comment on a few items. I think, for example, enrollment, there was a great fear that there will be a large number of children who will not come back to school. I always remember the definition that a third standard child gave me of enrollment. When I asked, this was a school in UP in a village, and I asked children, ये नामांकन का मतलब क्या होता है? तो बच्चों ने कहा कि नामांकन का मतलब होता है कि मेरा नाम स्कूल आ गया है. And I think that what ASER this year shows कि सबके नाम वापस आ गए हैं. In very large numbers, the names are back, which means that the school knows that these children want to come back to school. Now the challenge that lies ahead of us is to make sure that they do come back and they come back regularly. So in some sense, I feel the enrollment, the concept of enrollment is universally understood. As schools begin to reopen, start and stop and start again, 50% coming and 50% not coming and so on and so forth, we need to really track attendance very carefully. My own granddaughter, who went back to school for the first time in 20 months last week, described the situation from her eyes. She's 8 years old, she's 6 years old, and she described this as that the class of 30 has been divided into two groups, 15 and 15. 15 are being asked to come one day and 15 the other day. But of the 15 that she was in, only 7 came on that day. And I was thinking about the teacher. So the teacher, instead of having a group of 30 children to teach on a daily basis, now has 4 groups off and on. And she has to keep track of what all these children are doing. Big challenge for teaching learning as schools reopen and as we settle into these COVID protocols and yet teach children and help them to catch up. I think the other thing that has come out through this year's ASER and last year's ASER is that in every family, the family did what they could to help children to learn. Parents, father, mother, siblings have played a major role in this part, and often siblings are not really recognized. I think the challenge going ahead with us is how do you keep this family engagement, not just in schooling. Family engagement in schooling has always been high, but I think this family engagement for learning, which has begun, which showed a big engagement during the pandemic. How do we keep it going and not get back to a situation where the family saw its own role only as sending children to school? I think that this whole issue of devices, we know from ASER and from our own experiences everywhere that just because there's a device available at home doesn't mean that children have access to learning. And therefore, I would like to make a big case for us to prepare as a country to have digital device libraries for each school, or for even for each village or community, where these devices can be shared by groups of children or groups of adults as needed, because we are going to need this digital connectivity, the digital device and the digital content to supplement and support perhaps what is happening face to face. But this issue of equity, which I think all governments, all schools and families have been concerned with, how do we reach the last child? How do we reach children who are getting left out? I think these collective measures, sharing of collective resources, could really be a very big forward step in the event that we have to deal with these kind of disruptions in future. But remember that at a local level and at a personal level, these disruptions are always there. There's always some child who's sick and cannot come to school. There may be a part of our district which has floods, and therefore getting prepared to deal with disruptions in a collective manner, I think, is a long-run investment that we should do. And so I think, I don't want to keep you all longer, and I don't even have a lunch or tea to offer you beyond this. But I think as we look ahead, we can clearly see many challenges, but I'd like to outline 2 or 3 very clearly. One is, remember that the children who are in first and second standard today have not had any exposure to schooling. They may have already arrived in school, but they need a different kind of handling, whether we call it on the socio-emotional side or on the teaching learning side. They need to be given the advantage of a lot of school readiness and preschool activities that normally happen in normal years. And so I would urge those who are listening that there is no rush for our first and second standard children to be rushed into an academic curriculum. I think there's a lot to be done in building their cognitive skills, their social skills, in helping them relate to each other, to relate to teachers, and help them really build a strong grounding for learning. And now they may have had some of this at home, but now how do you create this strong grounding for learning in school is really the challenge that faces our first and second standard teachers and children and parents. For the kids who are older, clearly a big catch up on academic subjects is needed. A catch up on some very basic reading and math is needed. The country is quite seriously moving with FLN, foundational literacy and numeracy. But let's remember that these foundational literacy and numeracy is needed not just for the little kids, but also for children who are already in 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, who may need some brushing up, some strengthening, but they need to be given time in school to be able to do this catch up. And for the remaining months of the school year, I hope that every school and every state government will put catch up for these kids, 3rd standard and older, as a high priority. We know that our national education policy has said in bold, I think it's on page 8, that unless we have these basic reading and math skills in place, the rest of the policy is actually irrelevant. So I think we even have direction from our policymakers that this very solid catch-up is required. A 3rd catch-up, I think, is required, not for students, but for all the adults, because we have become very obsessed with this learning loss. We think that children have lost a lot, but I think we have to make an effort to really gain. I was at an education conference earlier this week, and some of the speakers from different states were saying, I remember the gentleman from Delhi spoke about the fact that for the first week, they put aside time just to hear what children had been through and to learn from what they said that could really guide the way that their teaching learning would proceed. So I think we have catch up to do on all sides, one kind of catch up for children, one kind of a catch up for grown-ups, and not forget that we've learned a lot of new things in these last 20 months, many of things that we should have learned a long time ago, but now having learned it, let's not forget them. We have put children at the center of our education process. We've put curriculum, in its support, but when the curriculum does not support the children's current level, let us really look at what they need and help them to move forward. I want to just mention that the usual ASER, which focuses on learning outcomes, rather than these last 2 ASERs, which have really probed learning processes, The learning outcome type of ASER, we managed to do one in Karnataka just before the second wave. Another one, the data has been collected after the second wave in Chhattisgarh. And there is another one which is likely to happen in Bengal. All of these should be available to us well before the next school year to really guide our thinking and our action in what we need to do for the next school year. And I would also urge decision makers, planners, and policymakers that let us begin our planning for the next school year well in advance. So the financial allocations that need to be in place are in the hands of those who can implement by April 1 and not have to wait for a long time into the next school year to start the process. So my best wishes to everyone, to our partners, to our teams, to those who are listening. I, in fact, want to recognize that ASER has many critics who've played an incredibly influential role in making us do our work better. So I would like to thank them as well, that let us use the remainder of this school year to do the leap forward with the young children and the catch up with the older children and the learning for all. We all need to learn how to help our children better so that the 2022-23 school year can be the most productive school year that India has ever had. So thank you everyone for listening. Please do, orange is the color of ASER 2021. Orange is also the color of my favorite mithai, which is jalebi. I would encourage everyone this lovely afternoon to go out and celebrate ASER 2021, eat jalebi, have fun, and remember that our children are our biggest resource and we need to do the best for them to the best of our ability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rukmini, Vilima, Madhav, for your comments, for sharing the findings and all your interesting views this morning with everyone today. I know we have seen a large number of people who have been watching the release on social media, and I'm sure people are very, very keen to dive into the findings of the report. So just as a reminder, again, the ASER 2021 report, along with all previous reports for those who are interested, can be found on asercenter.org. You can see the link to the website on your screen. For more information, please feel free to write to contact@asercenter.org or info@pratham.org. Thank you once again for joining us this morning. We very much look forward to your reflections, your comments, your engagement with the report. And please do share the link to this release event as well for those who you think would be interested. So thank you once again for joining us today and have a good morning.